So, dear colleagues, dear visitors from outside, online, welcome to Kaunas, Lithuania, to ICOMOS regional seminar on historic thematic framework on 20th century heritage, and a special focus on the thematics of internationalization, new nation states and human rights. My name is Davidas Lowenthalis. I'm from Kaunas University of Technology, historian of architecture, and I will give a short introduction on our topic and our aim of our meeting. But before the session starts, I would like to present the welcoming speech from Getty Institute. Actually, the Getty Institute is one of the organizers of this project together with ICOMOS 20th century. They produced this impressive document on dissemination of modern movement. So let's have congratulations from the Getty.
I'm Chandler McCoy from the Getty Conservation Institute. At the GCI, I manage the Conserving Modern Architecture initiative, which produced the 20th century historic thematic framework in partnership with the ICOMOS ISC20C. I am delighted to welcome everybody to the first of the European thematic framework seminars. As one of the authors of this document, it is extremely gratifying to see the work that ISC20C has done to develop this seminar series, which will help disseminate the 20th century historic framework and hopefully encourage its use. One of the aims of this thematic framework is to promote broad thinking about heritage places from the 20th century and facilitate better recognition, protection, and conservation of this valuable heritage. It looks at the principal social, technological, political, and economic drivers that have shaped the cities, buildings, industries, and landscapes of the 20th century. It emphasizes the broad forces, trends, and phenomena that have shaped the built environment. The 10 themes and their sub-themes were developed to be globally relevant to the 20th century at large, but it has always been our intention that it can be adapted to regional or national contexts as needed. This seminar and the others upcoming in the series will help to achieve this goal. By focusing each seminar on a specific sub-theme, like today's topic, New Nation States, they will focus discussion on the actual places that exemplify these themes. The GCI has previously conducted its own regional workshops in both Africa and the Middle East, where participants have had a chance to discuss, debate, and apply the framework to their own unique contexts. We know that today's seminar will provide you with a similar opportunity to get to know it and to see for yourself how it can be used in a European context. So with that, I wish you a productive and engaging seminar and hope that you too will find the thematic framework to be a useful tool. Thank you.
So, let's begin our seminar, and the structure of the seminar will be that I will give you a short introduction, and then we invite our guests to have a round table and to debate the topic deeper. So first of all, about what we are talking about and what is the 20th century historic thematic framework. Generally is a huge document which should help us, should help heritage community all around the world to debate and to identify the 20th century legacy as a possible and as a potential heritage. And from case of Lithuania and from case of Kaunas, we are actually in Kaunas, which during the between World War I and World War II was a temporary capital of Lithuania, and we have more than 6,000 buildings from that period. And obviously for us, each of these buildings is important, but the quantity of this legacy is enormous. So what is really important is to have a story behind this, to tell the narrative why we are important and which of these layer is maybe interesting from which perspective. So the document itself, it should help people to rethink the legacy of the 20th century in very different environments, in very different contexts, geographical, cultural, and political. And the structure of the document is based on 10 topics, and today we will discuss on one topic, which is nation states. But the seminar actually is a part of the bigger series of the seminars, and if you follow the website of ICOMOS, and especially ICOMOS 20th Century Scientific Committee, you can later follow on with other seminars in different places of Europe, and they will continue until the next year. So welcome to the first of these events, and this is the website which you can check and visit. Another important aspect regarding this seminar and our meeting, that we are meeting in the context of European Capital of Culture. Actually, Kaunas as a European city, as a part of a big family of capitals of culture, this year in 2022 have a status of European Capital of Culture. And that's why when we will talk about heritage framework, mostly we will focus, or at least the inspiration was to focus on interpretation, which is very important. And within the Capital of Culture, we have a program which is dedicated to the 20th century heritage, and it's entitled Modernism for the Future. And almost for 5 years, it was a lot of events around the legacy and around the heritage of, first of all, built heritage, but not only built heritage of modernism, and not only in Kaunas, but we had a lot of guests of artist residencies from all over Europe, and all these 5 what we done, we talked and debated and tried to tell the story of modern movement. So the event, the debate on historic thematic framework is in this context, in the context of a wider, let's say, event of European Capital of Culture. But let's come back to the document and the aims of the document. Actually, one of the most important aims, at least looking from my perspective, is that when we talk about 20th century heritage, usual textbooks and what I teach for my students in the first course, we talk about the most important iconic buildings. We talk about masters of modern movement, but probably it's not a full picture of what the 20th century left for us. And the aim of the document is to give a more full picture of what is real legacy of the 20th century. And as you can see, the document was structured according to different topics, like war and its aftermaths, like rapid urbanization and the growth of large cities, and 8 other topics. So today we will focus on one of these topics. And why it's important? I think at least we will discuss actually around the round table what is the importance of the documents, but one of the aims and how I find helpful in regarding of Kaunas, that it gives us a wider perspective on phenomena which have a global which are the part of the global movements and global changes in the 20th century. And the document itself, it can help us, first of all, to identify maybe something we are missing in our national lists, and if we look from the perspective of the topics which is relevant for the global modernization, so probably we can find some important aspects. It can be useful as well for interpretation. It means that, well, it's not enough to say that we have a collection of cultural heritage. It's important to tell why it's important. It's important to have a story. So again, the document can help us to have the story. And obviously, when we have a list and we have story behind protection, also important in this process. So let's come back to the topic number 6 and about nation states. Actually, the topic is much wider than just the most important examples of let's say, nation buildings. But one of the sub-themes of this theme number 6 is post-colonialism, independence, and emerging nation states. And actually, the beginning of this part of this essay in the document gives us a very important message that in the early beginning of the 20th century, the political map of the world was overwhelmingly imperial, but today we have different situation. And actually, if we look closer to the history of 20th century, we can say that, well, globally there is 3 periods of this. One of the period is interwar from 1918 to 1939, when Austro-Hungarian, German, Ottoman, Russian empires falls down, and a lot of new states, Lithuania as well, emerges on the earth. And I already mentioned a little bit that we are proud of Kaunas modernism, and it's not a secret. We are on the tentative list of UNESCO World Heritage, and you can see the title of our nomination is Modernist Kaunas, Architecture of Optimism. So we are part of this global process. Another wave of nation states relates to the processes in Africa and Asia, and its post-World War II processes. And the third phase is 19th, when Soviet Union collapsed, and we have again new nation states in Caucasus, in the Baltics, and what is really interesting that Lithuania experienced the birth of nation states, let's say, 2 times in the interwar and then rebirth of the nation states. So obviously for us this is important, and obviously we have some architectural evidence of the process. And for me, one of the like brilliant examples of the process is the Resurrection Church, which we started to construct in 1929 as a monument for independence, for first independence, obviously, and managed to finish just in 2000, so after almost 100 years. So such icons, we obviously witness the process. Another sub-theme is internationalization and international law, and a lot of international organizations which witness the development of the political system of the world in 20th century. And such organization, and as the Red Cross, for example, obviously it comes from the 19th century, but still it's part of the 20th century, and this is the Red Cross Health Spa in Birštonas, which is a small resort near Kaunas. And finally, the third part is human rights, civil rights, and individual rights. And the topic is quite wide, and we also, when talk about 20th century, we witness well, the rise of collective human and individual rights, the rise of racial, ethnic, and religious minorities, and also workers' rights. And what we have in an example is a small wooden house. Well, it's not small, but it's a wooden apartment. It's a budget dwelling for workers in Shančiai in Kaunas, in the area where the workers lived. And again, such documents actually raise the question at very local, at very basic level. Probably we should think about this architecture as a manifestation of existence minimum, as a concept of modernism in the regional, national, Lithuanian context. So, and what is really important when we talk about these processes that usually the witness, well, it might be icons, but not necessary. It might be very modest architecture. It might be places, as here is by an European picnic park in Hungary. It might be places which have no like impressive architectural structures. So how do we proceed with them, how we protect them as a heritage, or do we protect them as a heritage? It's very important questions, and we will try to debate on this with the colleagues. And finally, what is really important and what is the aim of our meeting, that we will try to give regional feedback for the well, authors of this document for Getty Conservation Institute for ICOMOS 20th Century. How do we see this whole idea of looking into 20th century architecture through the lenses of, let's say, 10 topics, and is it relevant in our context? Is it relevant in when we stand on the ground on somewhere in the let's say East Europe, in a city like Kaunas? So now I would like to invite our speakers on the scene, and we will change the scenario quickly. We will have chairs, so please welcome. So it's a pleasure to have you here, and it's like my colleagues from the region, but not only from the region, and with very different backgrounds. So probably I will start from the last, from here to the closest. So Grzegorz Patek is a Polish architect, architectural critic, writer who focuses on modernism a lot, and he's an excellent storyteller. With the last, we should congratulate him with the last book on Gdynia, which was published recently. Riin Alatalu, she's a associate professor in Estonian Art Academy and also a chairwoman of Heritage Conservation Council in Estonia, and what is the most important, vice president of ICOMOS. So welcome, Riin. Marija Drėmaitė, she's a professor of Vilnius University Faculty of History and prominent historian of architecture of our region, and also focuses on 20th century heritage, on interwar, on Soviet period. So welcome, Maria. And Edward Denison is a professor of architecture and global modernities at the Bartlett School of Architecture, UCL in London, and he's a researcher, writer, photographer, and independent consultant on heritage issues in places such diverse as Africa, China, Europe, so we have a global perspective as well. So welcome, and well, let's start the discussion. And as you know, the topic is probably a bit more focused on the nation states, but I would like to start probably from our reaction in a bit wider context, in our reaction on the document itself as a historic thematic framework, and what kind of benefits and probably challenges you see from such documents, and probably it witness that especially when it comes to the 20th century, we now experience kind of a transformation of ideas on what is value and what is heritage from the perspective of our generation. And this is the question for all of you, but I would like to start with Rin as a person from a representative of ICOMOS. Rin, could you make a reaction on this?
Thank you, Davidas. Yes, first of all, I'm very happy because when I read this document, I understood that it helps quite a lot to create a common ground and common understanding on the themes. And I would say that especially teaching and also at the same time making the inventories of heritage, it's really useful. And from the point of view of ICOMOS, I dare say that our scientific committee on the 20th century is really one of the most active committees of ICOMOS, which highlights the need for this issue, but at the same time, ISC 20th century, the scientific committee, is also the most eager one to launch heritage alerts, which means that to alarm about the disappearing or endangered heritage. And I think it's quite a symptomatic problem with the heritage of 20th century, that it's very much endangered. So this kind of a document helps us to promote the values of 20th century, but also to turn attention to the threats of it. And what I think, when we talk about the nation states, I think what is important is that it gives you a global view. I can't say about you, but I feel that in this Baltic corner, in the corner of Europe, we are very often very much stuck with our own history, and we can't see the bigger picture in the world, but this gives a very, very good comparison.
Yes, it's a small reaction to your note on the list in danger. Actually, someone said that for a building, the first 50 years is most dangerous. And if it survives 50 years, it might survive longer. So obviously, yes, 20th century is in prep. And what others? Grzegorz, maybe you some reaction to it?
Thank you for having me here. It's great to be in Kaunas, in this very special city. And but regarding the document, well, the 20th century was the first truly global century, and it manifests itself through architecture, you know, with the styles and with the technologies and the materials spreading globally on an unprecedented scale, and also the issues shaping architecture, the ideologies were spreading on a global scale. But at the same time, there is no single modernity. There is no single modernism. It's a multitude of modernities. It's a multitude of local, often very short-lived phenomena. And I think this document does a very great job at constructing a universal, a global framework for this multitude of different, diverse phenomena. And as it was already mentioned before, also the challenges that the 20th century is facing around the world are pretty comparable. So I hope this document will help solving these issues and help activists and heritage professionals and local professionals around the world to deal with these challenges.
I would like to draw the attention to the theme number 6 we are discussing now, and some contradiction that it presents in putting together internationalization and nation states and human rights. Because in this thematic framework, we can talk about the elephant in the room, the nation states. Because as many of us are academics or historians, and we know that in academia, we talk about the nation states in a very cautious way. Because we know not only its advances, but also drawbacks and how it developed into the Second World War, etc. So, but at the same time, it allows to see us a very large heritage which was unnoticed because of the highlight only on or focus internationally only on the international style, or these big masters of modern movement, and something that has only social aspects or international aspects, and denying that large part of the world was focused on building a nation state in this period is avoiding the elephant in the room somehow. So I think that it is especially urbanization of the new nation states and capital city construction, new administrative center construction that combined not only international style but also national style. It allows us to talk about the plurality of modernisms. And when we were preparing the nomination for Kaunas, modernist Kaunas for the UNESCO World Heritage, we were aware about that we are talking actually about the nation state. So how can we frame it, showing also not only the nation's directive to build a new capital city, but how civic initiatives were represented in it. Because it is very interesting about Kaunas. When we look at interval Kaunas, it was unique in this regard that it was the only provisional capital in the world at that time. But what it means being provisional or temporary? It meant that for the entire decade of the 20s, the state did not invest in architecture and representative architecture and buildings because they were waiting how the situation will develop. But we see in this period a huge boom in housing construction. And in this civic initiative to build housing in different styles, in different representative approaches, I think we can see the civic initiative, multiculturality, multi-religious of all the new Kaunasians. So yeah, it can be very challenging to show how can you be both unique and characteristic, because usually we as a response to Kaunas nomination we heard, but okay, it's really a characteristic feature of the period. It's okay, it's well represented in the nomination. But what's unique? What's outstanding about Kaunas? And yeah, it is challenging to think, can a site be characteristic and exceptional at one, both, represent both those values? And I think Kaunas can, because on one hand, it represents the historic processes that were common for very large part of Europe, at least the Europe, but at the same time, it survived and preserved the best in these processes in architecture and urban planning. So I think it can be combined.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. It's lovely to be back in Kaunas and to be part of this panel, particularly also because with another project, which I'll probably mention later, we've been working with the Getty on the thematic framework, and it's been a very insightful opportunity to explore their questions in preparing it and its relevance or intended relevance universally. So just to address your two questions about the opportunities it presents and the challenges also. I mean, the opportunities, you mentioned teaching. personally teach at the Bartlett School of Architecture, and with my colleague who will be speaking tomorrow, Ren Guangyu, who's in the audience, we were responsible for setting up a new program, and as architectural historians we had to question what architectural history means in the 21st century. And what we felt was very helpful with the thematic framework was that it provided a new approach that was different from the 19th century survey, which has survived throughout most of the 20th century, and I think has undermined our way of seeing built environments globally, to categorizations of styles, of masters, of periods, of regions, and it tries to break those things down. And that, I think, has been really helpful. So we've used it, and we've been working with the Getty to work out maybe how best we can use it in education, so new students of the 21st century understand, of the 21st century, understand the 20th and the 19th, of course, which fed into it, in a different light. And I think that's really important, to get away from these styles, away from these categorizations, away from the survey. I mean, they have their uses, but not as a central mode. Where it's challenging, I think, is this assumption of universality, which I think touches on your point about the unique or the exceptional and also the universal when it comes to nominations. We tested the thematic framework with our African colleagues as part of this project called Modern Heritage of Africa and Modern Heritage in the Anthropocene. So the acronym for that is MOHA, M-O-H-O-A. Google it. So last year we had a conference on Modern Heritage of Africa, and part of the preparation for that conference was a workshop with the Getty, with a lot of African colleagues, to interrogate how this intention for a universal framework applied in the context of Africa. Not because we were interested solely in Africa, but because we're dealing with the Anthropocene. So we're trying to learn from Africa and understand how that applies to all of us in the 21st century. And we found it to be quite problematic in its assumptions about the universal. It was still carrying a lot of that Eurocentricity or Western centricity as a legacy of the 19th and 20th centuries, which just didn't apply to a lot of African contexts. I would suggest that maybe that would also occur if you interrogate that locally here too. And that's an open question. I don't know, but that's certainly what our colleagues in Africa found. And I think that's very interesting. It's not to criticize the thematic framework. I think it's an excellent document, but it's very interesting when it sets out to do something to then sort of interrogate it and see if it stands up to that scrutiny. And hopefully there'll be subsequent editions from which we can all learn.
Thank you. And well, actually, your answers probably somehow directs our discussion to a more probably focused and more precise answer on the theme number 6, and one of the aims of the document to help to identify maybe new buildings, new places which should appear on the list. And obviously, if we are talking about our region, from my perspective, I would say recently I'm working on the documents about very small city in Lithuania. It's Plungė, like 50,000 inhabitants. I'm thinking, how could I apply this document? And I find it's not so easily, actually. The idea of having topics is brilliant, and it helps you to bring forward maybe some unusual places. You find another explanation, another like angle, but also it's helpful, I would say, at some points. And that's my experience, and I would like to ask what is your experience and what's your ideas? And probably I will start this question with Maria. She's a historian of architecture in the region. So could it be helpful tool for identifying new heritage in our region? What is your opinion?
Okay. I must admit that it's a perfect teaching tool. Yeah, and if you want to give an overview, what's important, how it can be framed, especially for students or for some groups of people who are interested, it's a perfect tool. But yeah, it's a very good point, how it works if you want to apply it on some practical some practical measures. I can share my experience again with the nomination of the Kaunas optimistic architecture. And we did this nomination in two parts, because when you submit the nomination, you receive some comments from the ICOMOS and as expert, and you can provide additional information if there are questions or comments on the nomination. So when we were preparing the nomination, we did not use this tool because it wasn't produced yet. But when we were preparing the additional information, when we received comments, somehow, yeah, we even used it name by name, theme by theme, just showing what can be found in Kaunas from each theme, from each site characteristic to the period. And I don't want to say that if you find in more numbers of matching themes and sites, it is better, or the heritage site is richer. But it can help to structure points, and when you need to define attributes of the site, valuable attributes, it can really help to structure it.
Thank you. I would say that and on the front cover it talks of heritage places, and I think that's one helpful way in which it's tried to reframe our understanding of what 20th century heritage is. The strength of the narrative up to now, and still persisting when we look at the new nominations for Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier, is this master narrative. And if we try and change towards a more place-based or process-based understanding of what occurred in the 20th century and what we're left with as heritage, we need to move away from the object of an architectural icon, and I think therefore it throws up the question of all sorts of heritage processes, whether they're captured in a structure or not, or whether they're through a place, a wider conceptualization of what a heritage site is, I think is very helpful. So hopefully it moves away from this idea of a sort of a bounded site that has to have a rigid boundary. You know, one side of the street is inside the site and the other side is outside, and so you're either in or you're out, and does that mean you don't have value and inside does? All of these questions that the systems that we've created, for good reason and goodwill, I think need to be questioned in the 21st century. So the idea of new places or processes from the 20th century being understood as heritage sites. So tomorrow we're talking in our panel, I think, on nuclear heritage. You know, that toxic waste could be a 20th century heritage. It most certainly is, in my view. You know, that's a really interesting question. Is air pollution heritage? I think these are the questions we need to start asking ourselves in the 21st century, and moving away from what we conventionally see as 20th century heritage, which has been dominated by architecture for all sorts of reasons. So I think in that respect, the themes do help to push us in that direction, to continue that sort of momentum, which is, I think, going in the right direction generally. But UNESCO is a big beast, and it takes time to change.
Yeah, I think that UNESCO is just creme de la creme, and we actually have to deal with the protection of heritage and evaluation on daily basis and our daily lives. But I was thinking when I was reading this document that Estonia made its own inventory of the 20th century heritage already 15 years ago. It started with the demolition of former Communist Party house in the middle of our capital city, Tallinn, and it triggered us that now it's the time to make the inventory. And if I compare this inventory that we made with the guidelines we got now, we could have made it much better. But anyway, we are very happy what we've done, but it could have been much more better. And also you notice if you invent things yourself that there might get a lot of gaps, and also some thematic topics and also some regions are very much, they have the face of the inventor who made the inventory, not this systematic approach. But nevertheless, it has been this inventory, which, by the way, in Estonia, we considered the 20th century. We started it with 1870, when we got the railway, and we ended it with 1991, when we regained the independence. So it was this inventory, the fact that we have it, and we have it really on very broad scale, from really architectural masterpieces to ordinary living premises. It has been extremely helpful to protect the heritage. But now I don't know if we end up there, but probably we will, the attitude has changed a lot because of the Ukrainian war, and we will have to have a new chapter into all of this.
You asked about identifying gaps, and I agree that by getting away from styles and masters and by focusing on themes, this document can help us to identify those gaps, especially those everyday places, you know, the places of the less impressive, the less monumental spaces that are often overlooked in heritage protection. And but I also think that this document helps to appreciate one particular phenomenon that it doesn't mention it, but it makes room for it. It's called dissonant heritage, and it's, you know, it's something that is making waves around the academic community around Europe right now. It's the legacy of oppression, the legacy of totalitarianism, of colonialism, etc. So those buildings that have or spaces that have a certain stigma attached to them, and there's something that is not to be hidden, not to be erased. Something, you know, these are places that should be studied and that should be learned from and preserved. And there are some great lessons to be learned from them. And I believe, you know, that architecture history and the heritage protection shouldn't be just about telling stories that we are proud of. That could be more like therapy, you know, like, you know, going through some traumatic experiences, learning from them, and maybe possibly avoiding them in the future, thanks to this frank discussion and about these spaces and these phenomena and these processes that shape them. So I think something that could be, you know, developed, maybe deepened in this document in the future.
May I just add that it was the same what I noticed. I even made a search through the document, and dissonant heritage is not mentioned. So yeah.
I checked for it.
So it could be a reaction from our region. It's not to forget this dark parts of the history. Obviously, there is a chapter on the war, but it's not talking
there
about...
are examples. There's the Ceausescu Palace in Bucharest mentioned explicitly in the document, but the term is not mentioned.
But then my question goes to Grzegorz and for others as well, to look a little bit deeper into this part of, let's say, inconvenient, unappreciated, politically at least, heritage. And well, if we have such a global perspective, if we have such a document, could it help us in a very different corners of the world, of the global, of Europe, but other continents as well, to deal with this? Because, well, when you talk, when you look from the theoretical perspective, yes, it's a nice move towards more open heritage list, towards more inclusive, towards rethinking heritage as a collection of the best, and moving towards a collection of something to learn, and of course to rethink a good part of the history as well as a painful part of the history. But if you just suggest to include such places into conventional heritage list, well, the society, obviously, it's not it might be not so happy, and it raises a lot of questions. So do you think that such a global perspective and such documents could help to deal with heritage, or just to identify? What is your opinion?
Well, certainly, it was already mentioned today that this document can be a great learning tool or a great aid in education. So, because it reframes our thinking of what is interesting and what is not interesting, and what could be studied and what is worth preserving. So, in this way, it's a great start in reshaping the criteria and the priorities. And so it also shows, by drawing our attention to these everyday spaces or making this possible, it also points at this very important thread in 20th century architecture, that architecture was often used as a very powerful tool of social change or addressing certain issues like the housing crisis. And I think that it could also influence the contemporary architecture practice, because I think we live in a time where architecture doesn't have enough self-confidence, and architects don't believe in that architecture can make a difference. They see their profession in a very as a service. And when you look back especially like the mid 20th century, architecture was at the height of its prestige and its power. And by looking back at this period, I think it could help contemporary architecture and contemporary practitioners to regain this confidence. Yeah, that's, I think, the most general.
It's very interesting note, and coming back, by the way, to European Capital of Culture and the program of Modernism for the Future, actually one of key points was the idea to understand heritage as a cultural reference, not a heritage as something just tangible. As far as I remember, the concept of cultural reference was mentioned in the Granada Convention, but just mentioned and never explained deeper. So probably it's a kind of a cultural reference to think about for the contemporary architects as well, and how we develop our urban field in a certain topics. Yeah. And Breen, what do you think? Could it help to deal with this dark side of 20th century?
I think that definitely it helps, and especially coming back to the current situation that we have the removal of the Soviet monuments and Soviet traces in our countries, and it's. I think it's the same like it is in Estonia. In Estonia, it's the decision of politicians and not experts to remove the monuments, and that means that actually we don't have any academic research background to these processes. So having a thematic framework that touches also these issues is at least something that we can bring up into these public debates that are going on. So I think it would be very, very interesting, and I think it's also something that was it was mentioned in this document, but maybe not so deep as I would have wished. Is the fate of our countries where we have gained the independence? We are the new nation states twice. So it's not only the first period in 1920s and 30s, but we are new nation states twice in 1990s, and all the changes that took place, like revolutionary changes in attitudes and things. It's quite an interesting process that is still on our shoulders and with us at this moment.
But I also don't want to remove the tangible heritage at all from the agenda, because all buildings have stories. have stories. And we can research them again and again and find new layers. And for example, in Kaunas, I think it was very good point when we started to interpret those modernist interwar buildings not only by style or by architect, but giving back the names of owners. And it's not a tenement house in modernist style designed by a master architect, but it was built by the Jewish entrepreneurs who disappeared somehow after 40s. So, and by giving those names of the owners of residence, it showed up that around 30% of all modernist Kaunas was built by Jewish entrepreneurs, which was erased, this memory. And now we are giving back it. And of course, it raises the next question, how it happened that they are not present here anymore? And how was this history erased, and why is it coming back again now? So each site can tell you this, through these layers, these stories.
Yes, exactly. It's a very good comment. But even if the building is, let's say, we are happy with the heritage and the building is by itself like important, but it might have very different stories behind it. It's really good point.
I just wanted to add, I mean, one thing that you've spoken about, an elephant in the room, and also the word power was used as well. And I just want to draw attention perhaps to those two points. For me, one of the elephants in the room that future generations will look back upon and look at us as historians or as people interested in the 20th century or architecture is why we gave so much sort of admiration to something which was fundamentally so unsustainable. When in, say, 50 or 100 years from now, you know, our children, our grandchildren, grandchildren's grandchildren, will see that century as the tipping point that really undermined perhaps even their existence. We don't know yet. And I think that's an element of modern heritage which needs to be addressed, is how it created this anthropocenic condition. And it's understandable that maybe past historians and continuing historians see these objects as really important. They are, of course, important, but they're part of a process which has potentially brought us to the brink of extinction. And I think that's an element of modernity which needs to be addressed and understood, because we have to deal with these infrastructures, you know, these housing estates, you know, vast housing estates around the world which are inefficient, they're poorly insulated, and that's just one example, let alone the infrastructures, the roads, the road systems. You know, these are all heritage of the 20th century which instill this phenomenal network of, I would say, power, whether that's fossil fuels, gas systems, and that's something that we and our future generations have to handle. The other aspect of power that I want to draw attention to just quickly is the heritage industry itself. I mean, talking about sites that, you know, how we might include other sites. Europe has, I think I'm right in memory, 485 cultural sites on the World Heritage List, and Africa has 89. So it's a ratio of 5 to 1. That's cultural sites. In modern heritage terms, Africa has one site. So that's a continent about, I think, 5 times the size of Europe, with one modern heritage site. And that site in itself is Asmara, the capital city of Eritrea, which is a European colonial capital. So our conceptualization of heritage reflects the power that created the industry that ascribes value to these sites. And I think that's something we also need to address very urgently. That do we see culture through this, continue to see culture through this lens that is essentially a European lens, and deny other types, other examples of modern heritage, which aren't buildings, which aren't even systems. So when we talk about, for example, buildings having stories, of course they do, but maybe so do trees or pavements, national parks, for example, or slave routes. You know, they all tell stories, and I think it's just shifting that lens to understand a wider, not just conceptualization, just understanding the wider reality of what the world went through in this seminal century. And it was a seminal century, and it will become even more seen as that by future generations than perhaps we can possibly see.
May I tell you that I think that denying this other heritage is not the right word, but because we are not denying it, but the question is that we are not promoting it as actively as we are promoting European heritage. Maybe this is the difference. But I think this thematic framework in that sense is really very good because it gives emphasis to different heritage in different parts of the world. So it's I would say it's rather like equal.
I think, yeah, that's right. And I think we need to go beyond equality, though. No. And I always promote with my students the word, I don't know in Lithuanian, but equity. There's a lot that we need to undo in order to gain equality some point in the future. Now, that point will never come, but to do that, we have to invest much more resources in order to not deny those things. Yeah.
And, well, responding to your last response, I would like to come back a little bit to the whole document, not just topic 6, and maybe to have a kind of a conclusion, but conclusion probably from other perspective, from a perspective of local, different local communities, and again maybe being a bit critical or maybe just questioning from that side. Isn't it that such documents they expose a kind of a top-down approach, and would it be different from just, let's discuss on this, would it be different if you let's say suggest to discuss what is value in different regions? And first of all, I apply this question to Edward. What is your opinion if the, let's say, experts in Africa, experts in Asia would write such a document? Would it be different?
I think it would be completely different, yeah. No question. I don't know how it would be different, but I think that you spoke of value, and I mean, having worked on several nominations, I find that one of the hardest things to sort of try and pin down, because it can be argued from both sides, as can integrity and authenticity. And so just, yeah, certainly from the workshop that we had with the Getty, with our African colleagues, I think it was just after the thematic framework was published, it was clear to them that a lot of what the understandings of the 10 themes from the authors were very different from how they were perhaps perceived on the ground in the context of Africa. And it was a very continental group that we had. It wasn't just one part of a region of Africa. So I think in short, it would be a very different document. That's not to say that this is invalid in any way, but I think it is of its place, as you were saying. Any author can, you write a list, it's going to reflect the author's hand, as does the heritage industry globally. And I think that's the same here. I think it's good to reflect upon it regionally. It's really important that we do. But maybe that's a useful exercise, that one would provide an alternative thematic framework from different parts of the world. And I mean, I think that's the challenge for the 21st century, is that we are living in an age, and I referred to the Anthropocene earlier on, only because we're all having to deal with the consequences of the century we're all interested in. And they're accelerating in this current century. So we need to find ways to speak across these continents, because they unite us all now by the threats they pose. So that's maybe something to put to the Gettys. We have an African one and an Asian one, not to provide alternatives, but just to see how that process would play out if it were from different cultural groupings.
Maybe you could.
Well, I think still from a Polish perspective, this is my perspective. This document is bringing something new to the table, and especially in theme number 6, there's the abuse of human rights mentioned. I think that would be a very new thing in Poland, because we are very much focused on the nation building, like the relevance of certain monuments or places to our nation building and to our national trying to create a uniform national tradition. And this document, both by mentioning the abuse of human rights and both by addressing this global phenomena of urbanization, industrialization, transport networks, etc., it shifts the attention, into other directions, and that's very valuable.
Yeah, I was also catching these human rights issues that in ICOMOS I'm also the member of our rights-based approaches group, which also discusses the ways how to involve local communities, how to give them more voice, more the rights, and I think this is one of the attitudes how this document can also be very well used in the work. So it's giving the voice to the people, not always giving the rights, but at least giving the voice is already a huge step ahead.
And Maria, do you have some final remarks?
Well, in one way, it seems that this thematic approach gives all geographical equality to test in which, regardless the region, what processes were taking part in one or another region. But now when I listen to Edward, so I see that even the imagination of important processes that are associated with the 20th century can be differently framed.
And actually, I would add, I just mentioned Plungė, it's a very small town in Lithuania, but I think it's really good case study because we will do on Saturday the discussion on this document, and I already see before preparing the discussion that it's possible to question, maybe not necessary to question, maybe it's not questioning, but approaching this document differently from on the global scale, different cultures, but also on micro level. When you go to the micro level, actually it can become a little bit different because, well, it's a very good idea to think about problems as a themes, not as a buildings, but what is behind the buildings. But these themes for such a small city, it could find a little bit different. And how, for example, one of the topics, how way of people earning money. It's a topic, how we earn the money, but maybe we can put it at one point, but it was to survive. How do you survive? Where do you live? And these broader questions, actually, it's, I think, in my feeling, it's in line with the whole attitude of talking of 20th century in terms of themes, but not in terms of achievements and great structures, great engineering, which is obviously important, but it adds another dimension. And now it's a lot of light and I don't see auditorium, but probably there are some questions from internet or from auditorium. No questions. Good. So it was a big pleasure for me to have you here on the scene and to discuss this incredible document in city of Kaunas in Lithuania, in European capital of culture, in temporary capital of Lithuania, and I hope it's just the beginning of wider European discussion in different regions, in different places on the same topic, and we will see in next year probably the conclusion of all these round of the seminars, what we will be. And for now, thank you for being here, and thank you for those who were watching, and well, see you in the conference who are here tomorrow, and so thank you and bye-bye.